5,000 isn't enough anymore, sweetheart. Make it 8. Or the health inspector finds something ugly in your walk-in cooler by Friday. Lieutenant Grant Halsey said it, the way other men order a second cup of coffee. Like the words cost him nothing at all. Like the woman behind the counter was a line item he'd already closed out in his head. He set his mug down on the glass display case, right on top of the taped seam, where the glass had cracked 2 winters ago, and he didn't apologize for the ring of coffee it left behind. Before you understand why that sentence made the air in that small grocery store go so still that the ceiling fan seemed loud, you have to go back 19 days. The town was called Caldwell Hollow, tucked into the folds of the Blue Ridge foothills in western North Carolina, the kind of place where the post office closed at noon on Saturdays and everybody still called the four-way stop by the name of a hardware store that hadn't existed since 1998. The light in Caldwell Hollow in early October had a particular color to it, gold going toward rust, and it fell across Route 9 in long bars between the buildings, catching the dust that never quite settled on Main Street. The building at 214 Maple Row had a green door with a brass bell mounted crooked above the frame, and when the door opened, the bell didn't ring so much as cough. 2 dull notes that had announced every customer for 17 years. Inside smelled like fresh bread from the oven in the back, ground coffee, and the particular sugared sweetness of the penny candy bin by the register that nobody had called a penny candy bin in decades, but everyone still did. The store was called Voss General Store, and it belonged to a 56-year-old woman named Eleanor Voss, who unlocked that green door at 6 a.m. in the morning, 7 days a week, the same hour she'd been unlocking it since the spring of 2009. Remember the bell. It matters later. Eleanor was not a large woman, and she did not carry herself like someone who needed to be. She had steady gray eyes, hands that moved without wasted motion, and a way of listening to people that made them feel like the only person in the room, even when the room had 6 people in it and a line at the register. She remembered that Mrs. Doyle from the Blue House on Lark's Spur took her coffee dark, no sugar, and had it ready sometimes before Mrs. Doyle finished saying, "Good morning." She remembered that 81-year-old Wexler Combs paid an exact change because he hated the weight of coins in his coat pocket, and she counted out his total to the penny before he'd even set his basket down. She remembered that the 3 teenagers from the Birchwood apartments came in every day after last bell at Caldwell Hollow High and bought the same bag of salt and vinegar chips, laughing at something on somebody's phone, and she never once made them feel like trouble just for existing near her shelves. In 17 years, nobody in that town had ever caught Eleanor Voss shaving a price, padding a total, or shorting a customer a nickel. Not once, not even on the months when the register drawer stuck on its track and she had to skip her own dinner to keep the shelves full. She never let politics into the store. She never let gossip pass the threshold. When customers tried to drag her into an argument about the county or the state or whatever was on the news that week, she turned it gently back toward the weather, or the high school football score, or whether the Hendersons' tomatoes were coming in early this year. What nobody in Caldwell Hollow knew was that behind the store, past a wall of cardboard boxes and a filing cabinet with a bottom drawer that hadn't closed properly since the Clinton administration, there was a gray steel lockbox. Inside that lockbox, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth that hadn't been unfolded in 11 years, sat a dented dog tag on a snapped chain, a photograph of 9 people standing in front of a nondescript building with no sign, and a laminated card, edges gone soft, that read United States Army. LT. Eleanor R. Voss, Task Force Sable. She had commanded that task force for 6 years. Most of what it did was still classified. Most of the men who had once saluted her would not have believed. Looking at the woman restocking canned soup at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning, that she'd once sat across a table from three-star generals and told them, calmly, exactly what she needed to bring her people home alive. To Caldwell Hollow, she was just Eleanor from the store on the corner. Quiet, steady. The kind of unremarkable that people trust precisely because it never asks to be noticed. She had left that life behind on purpose. When she hung up the uniform, she told herself the world she was walking into needed nothing from her that a decent grocery store couldn't provide. Bread, milk, a kind word. The truth about the price on the shelf. For 11 years, that had been enough. Then, on a Thursday evening in late September, as she was pulling the security gate down over the front window, Sal Renner, from the hardware store, 2 doors down, crossed the sidewalk fast, hands shoved deep in his coveralls, and stood too close when he spoke. "It's going to be your turn soon, Eleanor," he said. "I don't know how to say it plainer than that." He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Eleanor had been watching the pattern build for months, the way a person watches a front moving in over the ridge, long before the first drop falls. Squad cars idled outside storefronts, 3 times longer than any real patrol required. Shop owners stepped out to talk to officers in low voices and came back inside walking smaller than when they'd left. Louise Tanner's bakery had raised its prices twice in one season for no reason she'd explain. Arthur Whitcomb's pharmacy on the corner of Fifth had started closing an hour early, and when Eleanor asked him about it, he only shrugged and looked at the door like it might open on its own. She'd told herself, for months, that this wasn't her problem. She'd told herself she'd left a life of interference behind when she folded that uniform for the last time. But that Thursday night, Sal Renner's warning settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. And she found herself standing at her own front window long after closing, watching the empty street the way she used to watch a perimeter. Cataloging exits, counting shadows, thinking, for the first time in 11 years, like someone trained to see the shape of a threat before it fully arrives. 19 days later, Grant Halsey walked through her green door and set his coffee cup on her cracked display case. He was broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that seemed permanently clenched, and a voice built to fill a room before the rest of him arrived. He had 2 officers with him that first afternoon. Troy Kessler, a lean man with restless hands, and Marcus Bird, younger, quieter, who stood by the door with his arms crossed and his eyes sliding across the shelves like he was pricing them out for later. Remember Bird. He matters more than he looks like he does right now. Halsey called it a community protection contribution the first time, said it so smoothly it almost sounded like a real program. The way a lie sounds reasonable once the liar has repeated it so many times he's stopped hearing it as a lie. $5,000 a month. He explained what would happen if she said no, ticking the possibilities off on his fingers, like he was reading from a checklist he'd used a dozen times on a dozen other storefronts. A health code violation that didn't exist, a fire marshal visit that would find problems that weren't there, a patrol car parked outside her door at every hour a customer might want to come in. A man near the bread aisle lowered his eyes and studied the floor. A woman near the register set down her carton of milk without a word and slipped out the door. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She wiped her hands on the small towel she kept by the register, folded it once, and set it down with the same unhurried care she gave to everything. She looked only at the badge on Halsey's chest, at the name stitched above the pocket, and she asked him, quite calmly, whether that order came from the department or from him alone. The 3 of them laughed. It was the easy, loose laugh of men who had never once been told no. Men who had built their whole sense of themselves on the certainty that nobody would ever ask that question back. Halsey told her she had 1 week to think it over. He did not know that the last time someone had given Eleanor Voss 1 week to think something over, it had been a 3-star general asking whether she'd take command of the most classified task force in the building. She had said yes in 4 seconds. This time, she said nothing at all and let him mistake her silence for fear. That was the first tier. It would not be the last. 6 days later, on a Wednesday that started ordinary and did not stay that way while Halsey came back, this time with all 3 officers, and this time in front of witnesses. It was 11:40 in the morning, the store half full with the lunch crowd from the county courthouse 2 blocks over, when Halsey walked in, looked directly at Eleanor, and announced, loud enough for every person in that store to hear, that Voss General Store had failed a health inspection that morning and would need to close for further review, effective immediately. There had been no inspection. Everyone in that store, including the county clerk, standing by the register with a sandwich in her hand, knew there had been no inspection, because the actual county health inspector had been in that same store the previous Friday and passed it clean. This was the second tier. Public, deliberate, impossible to explain away as a misunderstanding. Halsey wanted witnesses. He wanted the town to watch him do it, because a threat that nobody sees is just a rumor, and Grant Halsey had learned that fear spreads fastest when it has an audience. Eleanor stood behind her counter with both hands flat on the wood, and she did not move. She did not raise her voice. She did not look away from him. Something in her face went very still, the particular stillness of a person deciding, in real time, exactly how much of herself to show and how much to keep in reserve. And the county clerk standing 3 feet away would later tell an investigator that the silence in that store, for about 4 seconds, felt heavier than anything she'd ever stood inside. That's the first frozen moment. Hold on to it. There's a second one coming, and it costs Grant Halsey everything. The third tier came 2 days after that, and it was the one that finally showed the whole street exactly what kind of men had been running Caldwell Hollow's police department. Officer Troy Kessler walked into the store alone that Friday afternoon, while Eleanor was restocking canned soup near the front window, and without a word, without a warrant, without so much as looking at her, he reached into the register drawer she'd left half open while she worked and took $340 in cash, the entire contents of the till, and dropped a printed slip on the counter that read, in block letters, penalty for non-compliance. He walked out whistling. That was the moment Sal Renner, watching through his own front window across the street, finally understood exactly what it's going to be your turn had meant for every shop owner on that block for the past 3 years. And it was the moment old Wexler Combs, standing at the register with his exact change already counted into his palm, watched Eleanor Voss go very quiet, and later told his daughter he'd seen men come back from deployments with that exact look on their face, the look of somebody doing math nobody else in the room could see. Here is what nobody in Caldwell Hollow understood yet. Eleanor Voss had spent 6 years running operations against men far more dangerous than Grant Halsey, and the single skill that had kept her alive through all of it was patience. She did not want revenge. She wanted evidence. And starting that Friday night, in the back room, behind the cardboard boxes and the broken filing cabinet, she began building a case with the same cold precision she'd once used to plan missions that entire governments would later deny had happened. She called one number. It belonged to a man named Colonel Marcus Webb, who had served 3 tours under her command, and who now sat 2 levels below the Pentagon in a job that officially did not exist. She told him 4 sentences. He asked her one question, "Do you need me there, or do you need me to make calls?" And she told him, "Calls first. If it goes the way I think it will, you'll know when to come." Then she called the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation and asked to speak to whoever handled public corruption. A field agent named Grace Halloran picked up on the second ring, and by the end of that phone call, Eleanor Voss had become something Grant Halsey never once considered when he set his coffee cup down on her display case. A cooperating witness with the training to run a sting better than most agents, twice her age. For 11 days, Eleanor did something that felt, to her, exactly like the old life. She wore a wire stitched into the seam of her apron. She kept a ledger of every visit, every threat, every dollar demanded, cross-referenced against register receipts, down to the cent. She recorded conversations with Louise Tanner and Arthur Whitco and Owen Pruitt, the diner owner 2 blocks down, and discovered that the protection scheme had been running for 3 years and had drained more than $190,000 out of 11 small businesses on that stretch of Route 9 alone. She learned Halsey's rounds, his routines, which officers were dirty, and which were simply too frightened to say anything. Marcus Bird among the second group, a fact Eleanor filed away without judgment, because she understood better than most people exactly how fear reorganizes a person's spine. On the 11th night, Agent Halloran's team wired $8,500 in marked bills, the new, escalated demand Halsey had made the week before, after deciding that Eleanor's calm made her look like easy money rather than a warning sign. And Eleanor placed the envelope on her counter at 9:15 in the evening, exactly as instructed. In the exact spot Halsey always demanded it. He arrived at 9:40. He picked it up without counting it, the way a man does when he's certain the counting has already been done for him 100 times before and never once come up short. That was the last calm moment of Grant Halsey's career. At 9:47, 7 unmarked vehicles closed off both ends of Maple Row. State agents came through Voss General Store's back door and the front at the same time, and Halsey, the marked bills still in his jacket pocket, his own hand still cold from where they'd been sitting against his ribs, was told to place his hands on the hood of his own patrol car. He did not go quietly. He shouted that this was a misunderstanding, that Eleanor Voss didn't know who she was dealing with, that people who interfered with him in this town regretted it. He had no idea how wrong that sentence was. 12 hours after Eleanor Voss placed that envelope on her counter, the Caldwell Hollow Police Department was sealed behind crime scene tape from end to end. Evidence, technicians, carrying out bankers' boxes in long, careful rows, while a small crowd gathered at the edge of the lot, the ways small towns gather whenever something they've whispered about for years finally becomes something they're allowed to say out loud. That's when the helicopter came in low over the ridge and set down in the parking lot of the department. Halsey had run like his own private toll booth. Colonel Marcus Webb stepped out first. Behind him came 2 more officers in plain dark suits, and behind them, walking without hurry, in the same gray cardigan she'd worn to open her store that morning, was Eleanor Voss. Layer 1 of the truth had already surfaced an hour earlier, when investigators searching the department's own evidence, lockup, as part of the corruption case, found something they hadn't expected: a sealed personnel folder that had been quietly requested and delivered from a federal liaison office 2 days prior, at Eleanor's own instruction, containing her full separation record. Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor R. Voss, Task Force Sable, Commanding Officer, 2013 to 2019. 3 commendations, 1 classification stamp that made even the lead SBI agent go quiet when he read it. Layer 2 came from Colonel Webb himself, standing in that parking lot in front of every officer who had once considered themselves untouchable in that department, saying, "had," in words clear enough to carry across the whole lot, that the woman they had just tried to extort had once commanded some of the most sensitive special operations missions the United States government had ever run, and that most of the men standing in front of him would never, in their careers, be cleared to read a single page of what she'd done. One by one, the officers standing in that lot lowered their eyes to the pavement, the weight of what they'd allowed to happen settling onto their shoulders all at once. The silence that followed was heavier than any siren could have been. The second frozen moment, and this one didn't lift for a long time. Grant Halsey did not lower his eyes. Even then, cuffed against the hood of his own cruiser, he told the agent standing over him that he'd done nothing different from what 3 chiefs before him had allowed, that the whole department ran on arrangements like his, that Eleanor Voss should be grateful he hadn't raised the number sooner. He said it like a man explaining policy. That was the moment Grace Halloran realized Halsey wasn't going to break in an interview room. He was going to keep explaining himself all the way to a verdict, because somewhere in his head, none of this had ever been extortion. It had been management. Near the edge of the lot, Sergeant Earl Whitfield, a 22-year veteran who'd served under 3 different chiefs and had gone numb to the arrangement long before Halsey ever rose to run it, quietly told Marcus Bird that he'd always known a day like this would come, that a debt built on fear eventually comes due, one way or another. Bird didn't answer him. He just kept staring at the marked bills being photographed on a folding table 6 feet away, thinking about every time he'd stood by that door with his arms crossed and told himself he was just doing his job. The trial started 11 weeks later, and the Caldwell Hollow County Courthouse, the same brick building 2 blocks from Voss General Store, was full from the first morning. The benches were packed with shop owners who had spent 3 years too frightened to say a word out loud, now sitting shoulder to shoulder in a silence that felt entirely different from the silence they'd carried for years. The prosecution built its case with the same patience Eleanor had used to build the evidence. Recordings played in full for the jury, ledgers projected onto a screen, the marked bills laid out in their evidence bags beside photographs of the safe investigators found bolted beneath Halsey's own garage floor, holding $61,200 in unmarked cash. Owen Pruitt testified about the envelopes he'd handed over every month for 2 years, his voice steady, even as his hands shook against the edge of the witness stand. Louise Tanner testified that she'd raised her prices twice, not because flour got more expensive, but because Halsey's number had gone up twice. The defense had almost nothing to work with, because Halsey had never once, in 11 days of surveillance, given them anything to work with. He took the stand anyway on the 4th day and told the jury, calmly, almost reasonably, that everything he'd done had been necessary to keep order on that stretch of Route 9, that small business owners needed protection whether they understood it or not, that Eleanor Voss had simply refused to see the arrangement for the mutual benefit it was. He never once said the word sorry. Not to the jury, not to Eleanor, not to the 11 business owners whose names were read into the record, one after another. The jury took 90 minutes to convict him on all 14 counts. The judge sentenced him to 18 years, and as the terms were read aloud, Halsey's face stayed unreadable in a way that made the courtroom colder rather than more forgiving, because everyone in that room understood, watching him, that he still believed he'd been right. Kessler received 9 years. Bird, who cooperated fully once the case broke and testified against both men, received 2 years probation and lost his badge, and stood outside the courthouse afterward telling a reporter, in a voice that cracked halfway through, that he should have said something the very first week, and that he would carry that particular silence for the rest of his life. The department was rebuilt almost from scratch under a new chief, brought in from outside the county. A restitution fund was established for the 11 businesses that had been bled for 3 years, and checks began arriving in mailboxes that had grown used to nothing but bad news. When the final sentence was handed down, a quiet murmur ran through the packed benches. Not celebration exactly, but something close to relief, the sound of an entire block finally allowed to exhale after holding its breath for 3 years. Eleanor Voss refused every interview request that followed. She turned down 2 television crews, a magazine profile, and a recognition ceremony the town council tried 3 separate times to organize in her honor. She simply went back to opening the green door at 6 in the morning, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. One reporter, more persistent than the rest, caught her early one morning while she was restocking canned soup near the front window, notebook already open, and asked her directly why she'd never told anyone in 17 years that she'd once commanded a classified special operations unit. Eleanor set the can down gently on the shelf and considered the question with the same calm she'd shown Grant Halsey on the very first day he walked through her door. "Honor was never something I wore on a uniform," she said. "It's something you carry in what you do after the uniform is gone." The reporter waited, pen still hovering, for more. Eleanor only smiled, picked the can back up, and went back to stacking soup in neat, even rows. The conversation closed as gently as it had opened. 6 months later, the block along Route 9 had begun to breathe again in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with its absence. Owen Pruitt reopened his diner with a fresh coat of paint on the walls and, on opening night, kept one table by the window reserved and empty, a small card resting on it that simply read, "Thank you." He never told anyone exactly who it was meant for. Louise Tanner's Bakery brought its prices back down to what they'd been 3 years earlier. Arthur Whitcomb stopped closing an hour early and stopped glancing at his own front door every time the bell rang. Sal Renner, standing in his hardware store doorway one morning with his arms crossed, watched the first customer in months roll a battered pickup up to his loading bay and didn't bother hiding the smile on his face. The morning that followed felt ordinary in a way Caldwell Hollow hadn't felt in 3 years. Sunlight spilling across the cracked sidewalk on Maple Row, dust motes drifting through the front window of Voss General Store. The bell above the door coughed its 2 dull notes as the first customer of the day stepped inside. And Eleanor, behind the counter, smiled the way she always had, the way she'd smiled at every customer for 17 years before any of this happened. She poured coffee for Mrs. Doyle. Dark, no sugar. She counted exact change into Wexler Combs's open palm without being asked, the coins clicking softly the way they always had. The 3 teenagers from Birchwood Apartments came in after school, laughing too loudly at something on somebody's phone, and bought the same bag of salt and vinegar chips they always bought. The register still stuck on the same track it always had. The bell still coughed the same 2 notes it always had. But on the wall behind the counter, where a crooked calendar had once hung forgotten, there now hung a small American flag beside a single dented dog tag on its snapped chain, no longer folded away in a lockbox in the back room. Visible now to anyone who cared enough to look up and notice it. Nobody who walked through that green door looked at Eleanor Voss as a victim anymore. They looked at her as an ordinary woman who had quietly stood her ground and protected an entire town, proving in the plainest way possible that real power was never meant to intimidate anyone. It was meant to protect them. If this story reached something in you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognized someone in it, tap like so it finds the people who need to hear it. Share it if you know someone who needs reminding that they are not invisible, and leave a comment. Have you ever stood in a room like that one? And if you had, which side of it were you on? I read every answer.